Good day everyone. Today we will tackle about data collection techniques. Data collection techniques, the questionnaire, the interview, and observation are most commonly used in survey research. They are data collection techniques or instruments, not research methodologies. The questionnaire, pre-questionnaire planning. Planning for the design of a questionnaire is an important stage in the development of a scientific study. The process will be given here in brief outline form as a way of outlining the major steps and emphasizing decisions that should be made before the data collection instrument is selected or designed. 1. Define the problem and purpose. 2. Consider previous, related research, the advice of experts, and so on. 3. Hypothesize a solution to the problem, or at least identify research questions, the answers to which will shed some light on the problem. 4. Identify the information needed to test the hypothesis. This step should include deciding which aspects of the problem will be considered and planning ahead to the presentation and analysis of the data. Deciding how the data will be organized, presented, and analyzed can significantly influence what types of data will have to be collected. 5. Identify the potential respondents or subjects. As noted earlier, practical questions should be asked at this time, such as, are the potential respondents accessible? Are they likely to respond? 6. Select the best or most appropriate technique for collecting the necessary data. It is here that the researcher should consider the relevant advantages and disadvantages of the questionnaire, interview, observation, and other techniques in relation to the more general methodology to be used. Advantages of the questionnaire. The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language defines a questionnaire as a form containing a set of questions, especially one addressed to a statistically significant number of subjects. It offers several important advantages over other techniques or instruments for collecting survey data and can be useful for many different types of surveys. Among them are the following. 1. The questionnaire, especially the mail, email, and web-based questionnaire, tends to encourage frank answers. This is in large part because it is easier for the researcher to guarantee anonymity for the respondent when using a mail questionnaire. 2. The characteristics of the questionnaire that help to produce frank answers also eliminate interviewer bias. This is not to say that the questions could not be worded in a biased manner, but that there is no style of verbal presentation which can influence the response. 3. Another way of stating the second advantage is that the fixed format of the questionnaire tends to eliminate variation in the questioning process. Once the questions have been written in their final version and included in the questionnaire, their contents and organization will not change. 4. The manner in which a mail questionnaire is distributed and responded to also allows it to be completed, within limits, at the leisure of the participants. This encourages well thought out, accurate answers. 5. Questionnaires can be constructed so that quantitative data are relatively easy to collect and analyze. 6. Questionnaires can facilitate the collection of large amounts of data in a relatively short period of time. Questionnaire-based surveys of several thousand people are not unusual, and responses typically are expected within 1 to 2 weeks. 7. Last, but not least, questionnaires are usually relatively inexpensive to administer. Disadvantages of the questionnaire. While the advantages of the questionnaire seem to outweigh the disadvantages, there are several of the latter that should be noted. 1. Use of the mail questionnaire eliminates personal contact between the researcher and the respondent. However, this also can be seen as an advantage, for, as stated earlier, the absence of direct contact eliminates interviewer bias from the questioning process. 2. The mail questionnaire does not permit the respondent to qualify answers to ambiguous questions or, at least, makes it more difficult. On the other hand, The more difficult it is for respondents to qualify answers, the more likely the researcher is to obtain consistent responses. 3. Studies have shown that persons who are highly opinionated regarding the subject of a questionnaire are more likely than others to be motivated enough to complete and return it. This phenomenon tends to result in a biased sample or return, as the less opinionated members of the sample will be underrepresented and may well have certain characteristics in common. 4. Questionnaires may be more difficult for uneducated participants to complete, again possibly resulting in a biased return. The researcher can minimize this problem by keeping his or her audience in mind when developing the questionnaire and writing the questions. 5. In general, there simply seems to be a resistance to mail questionnaires. In the extreme case, this can result in some participants attempting to sabotage a survey by purposefully responding incorrectly to some questionnaire items. This problem can be alleviated through appropriate research design, specific techniques of which will be mentioned later. 6. Non-response rates are relatively high for mail, email, and web-based questionnaires, although web-based surveys often first use another survey method to recruit participants. Since survey respondents are usually female, more educated, and older than those who do not respond to surveys, non-responses reduce the sample size and may introduce sampling error by eliminating a subset of the population. 7. If the questionnaire is distributed electronically, it will reach only those who have access to and are comfortable using email and web technology. Constructing the questionnaire. Proper construction of the questionnaire is essential to its success. In general, the researcher must consider his or her information needs and the characteristics of the participants. The former concern will be dealt with first. Type of question according to information needed. In selecting or writing specific types of questions, the researcher must first consider what kind of data he or she needs. The major types of questions, according to the kind of information needed, include the following. 1. Factual questions, questions used to ascertain such things as the respondent's age, gender, and so on. They are probably the most straightforward type of questionnaire item. 2. Opinion and attitude questions, questions intended to determine a person's ideas, inclinations, prejudices, convictions, and so on. 3. Information questions, questions designed to measure the respondent's knowledge about some topic. They typically require the greatest response time. 4. Self-perception questions, questions quite similar to attitude questions, but restricted to one's opinions about himself or herself. 5. Standards of action questions, questions used to determine how respondents would act in certain circumstances. For example, one may ask library patrons how they would react to a new library service or a change in hours. 6. Questions about actual past or present behavior, questions that potentially fall within some of the categories of questions already identified but tend to be narrower in that they focus on behavior. For example, the kind of information gathered to describe past or present behavior could be factual, attitudinal, or informational in nature. 7. Projective questions, questions that allow respondents to answer questions indirectly by imposing their personal beliefs, attitudes, and so on onto others. In other words, they permit the respondent to indicate how he or she would react to some question or situation by reporting how peers, colleagues, and so on would react in the same situation. Type of question according to form. There are two basic types of questions, open-ended questions and fixed-response questions. The researcher must decide which response format will be the easiest for the respondent while still producing adequate, definite, and uniform answers. Whenever possible, it is recommended that consistent response formats be employed. Examples of open-ended questions are: 1. What do you think about the library? 2. Which library services do you value the most? 3. I typically use the library in order to a fixed response or structured questions limit the responses of the participant to stated alternatives. The possible responses may range from a simple yes or no to a checklist of possible replies. Scaled responses. A variety of questions utilize scales of one type or another in order to obtain responses. One kind of scale is the rating scale. Specific rating scales, with examples, include the following. 1. An itemized rating or specific category scale. How important would each of the following items be to you in deciding to use a library? Circle one number on each line. 2. A graphic rating scale. This too is a scale designed to collect ordinal level data, but, unlike the specific category scale, the graphic scale allows the respondent to check anywhere along a continuum. 3. A rank order or comparative rating scale. Please rank, in order of importance, the following types of library services. Record of 1 for the most important, through 5 for the least important. Library instruction programs, reference services, circulation services, audiovisual services, study facilities. Question content and selection. The researcher must decide on the type of questions to ask in order to obtain the necessary information. One technique that can help the researcher avoid unnecessary and redundant questions, while asking those that are necessary, is to construct a variable question matrix. Question wording. The way in which the contents of questionnaire items are worded can also affect their validity and reliability. Consider the following two questions. Do you think the US should forbid public speeches against democracy? Or, do you think the US should not allow public speeches against democracy? Sequencing of questionnaire items. Changes in question order can produce substantial differences in responses to the same question. It is generally recommended that questions with a similar context be placed together. Sources of error. Before continuing with the outline of the procedures for developing a questionnaire, it may be worthwhile to consider some of the types of questionnaire error not already discussed. Some of the more common types of error or bias, not all of which are limited to questionnaires, are the following. 1. Researcher bias. In essence, this bias results from the researchers unconsciously developing the questionnaire in a manner that will increase the likelihood of obtaining the desired results. 2. Sponsorship bias. This bias results from the researchers, hopefully unconscious, attempt to produce research results that will please the outside agency funding the research. A researcher may well be suspected of such bias if his or her research is sponsored by an agency with vested interests in certain outcomes. 3. Imperfections of design. Weaknesses in the design of the questionnaire can result in biased or inaccurate responses. Such imperfections include haphazard sequencing, inadequate instructions, and a failure to explain the purpose and scope of the study. 4. Respondent interpretations. As implied earlier, varying interpretations of the facts and key terms by the respondents also can result in inaccurate answers. 5. Time lapse. It has been found that answers to the same question tend to vary over time even when not directly affected by the passage of time. It must be realized that perceptions, attitudes, and so on are not static in most cases. 6. Circumstances. A variety of factors, such as carelessness and mood of the respondent, ambiguous questions, unthinking answers, and general resistance to questionnaires, can produce inaccurate responses. 7. Response bias. Error can result from the response rate being low and thus the final sample ends up less representative than originally conceived. Some of the steps that can be taken to minimize response bias include using questionnaires only when one is reasonably certain that the subjects are interested in the topic, making responses confidential or anonymous, sending reminders to complete questionnaires, providing gift or cash incentives to encourage responses, Some incentives can be included with an email or web-based questionnaire by initiating a trigger for the gift when the questionnaire is completed and submitted, and being realistic about eligibility criteria for subjects. 8. Reactive insight. There is a growing concern that as subjects participate in surveys over time, especially in surveys dealing with sensitive topics, they may begin to rethink their lives, attitudes, and so on. This activity could then result in the participants being biased in certain areas and less representative of their larger populations. Preparing the first draft. The researcher must decide on the sequence of questions that best serves his or her purpose. This may mean ordering the items from the general to the particular, or the best arrangement may be by subject. When the topic changes noticeably, it is a good idea to provide a lead-in statement as a transition. Evaluating the questionnaire. An expert in research methodology can help to catch weaknesses in the instrument, such as faulty scales and inadequate instructions. A person who is familiar with the topic of the questionnaire can help in assessing the face validity of the questions. The pre-test. After obtaining an informal evaluation of the questionnaire, it should be pre-tested fully. Interviews and/or open-ended questions are necessary in order for respondents to have ample opportunity to point out problem questions. Final editing. The general rule is that the questionnaire should be as short as possible. The organization will benefit from the employment of outline format in lettering and numbering sections and questions. Unnecessary and redundant questions should be avoided, as well as those that ask for information not already held by the researcher. Cover letter. In most cases, a cover letter should accompany the questionnaire. It is not easy to conceal the nature of a study, and if respondents become aware that they have been misled, they are not likely to view the questionnaire favorably. In some situations, such as with instruments designed to measure certain values indirectly, it may need to be somewhat vague. Distribution of the questionnaire. There are three main methods of administering the survey questionnaire. The questionnaire can be self-administered, which means that the respondents are asked to complete the questionnaire themselves, administered face-to-face to respondents by researchers, or administered to respondents via the telephone by interviewers. The self-administered questionnaire can be mailed or electronically transmitted via email or the web. Mail questionnaire. The response period should be long enough to avoid rushing the participants but short enough that they do not forget about the questionnaire. Items such as free pencils, books, and so on are sometimes offered with follow-up mailings in an effort to encourage responses. Electronic questionnaire. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, email questionnaires were more popular because of the ease of transmission and immediacy of the delivery. Web surveys can be especially useful for surveying populations for which there is no list and for exploratory research. Email and web-based surveys can be designed to automate skip patterns and automatically validate answers. Survey responses are stored in databases that can be accessed online or downloaded into software programs. Nichols, Baker, and Martin report that computer-assisted survey research techniques may be more efficient than conventional techniques, without reducing the quality of the data. This is dependent upon the design of survey instruments that adhere to criteria such as the following. 1. Easy to read online. 2. Do not often require respondents to leave their computers to find information. 3. Do not take up excessive space in electronic mailboxes. 4. Are preceded by a separate introductory message. 5. Provide adequate instructions and on the screen where needed. 6. Anticipate how different systems will format the questionnaire. 7. Minimize cursor movement. 8. Do not assume more than basic computer skills. Electronic questionnaires should be designed using most of the criteria that have been discussed in the preceding text. They should include a few questions per screen, using graphics sparingly, and providing an indication of the respondent's progress in answering the questions. Sean Lau, Fricker, and Elliott provide a list of guidelines specifically for developing an electronic questionnaire. In his workshop cited above, Baker first identified a number of special challenges facing researchers planning to conduct web surveys. Those challenges included: 1. Different browsers can display screen information differently. 2. Screen resolution can cause problematic scrolling. 3. Screen width, horizontal scrolling can be problematic for participants. 4. Connection speed, heavy screens may download especially slowly. 5. Special functions and gadgets such as Flash may not work. 6. Corporate firewall. 7. Need to provide respondent support, FAQs, email, etc. Baker also provided numerous tips and suggestions regarding screen design, question presentation, and implementation. They included: 1. A web questionnaire, more so than a website, must be able to solicit information from participants with varying levels of motivation. 2. Progress indicators tend to work better with short questionnaires. 3. Scrolling versus paging is easy to program, shortens download times, and allows the respondent to view the entire questionnaire, but it eliminates control over the order of completion, tends to result in more unanswered questions, and makes skips and logic more difficult. 4. Factors such as the location of information on the screen, background color, navigation techniques, font type, size, and color can affect responses. 5. Careful thought should be given to error messages, instructions, definitions, and question format. 6. Question numbering is generally not useful for online questionnaires. 7. The size of the input area is a visual clue to the length of the expected answer. 8. Visual images can help to clarify questions but also can have unintended effects. 9. Things to avoid include document attachments, use of multiple URLs, HTML or graphics, special text formatting, and anything that looks like spam. 10. Appropriate authentication techniques should be used to ensure that only legitimate respondents participate and that each participates only once. The interview. Developing the interview. Developing a structured interview is an important step in the development of any kind of scientific study. The techniques for constructing questionnaires and interview schedules are quite similar and will not be repeated here. Conducting the personal interview. Interviewees should be asked a list of questions about the nature of the study and credentials. The interviewer should avoid rephrasing questions for the interviewee. It may be desirable to obtain the interviewee's permission to use the information in the resulting research report. Interviewers should be careful not to show surprise or other emotions as a result of any of the interviewee's responses. Disadvantages of the interview. Bias is a real threat to the validity of interviews. Some interviewer bias can be avoided by ensuring that the interviewer does not overreact to responses of the interviewee. Advantages of the interview. The interview is generally believed to be better at revealing information that is complex or emotionally laden. The data gathered from internet interviews can be easily uploaded to data analysis software packages. Focus group interviews. The focus group is a group interview designed to explore in depth the feelings people hold and to learn how these feelings shape overt behavior. Focus groups can be used as a self-contained research method or in combination with other quantitative and qualitative research methods. Notes of focus group sessions are often taken with the aid of audio recordings, but at some point tape recordings must be transcribed and reduced to a more manageable size. Recorders often use forms to facilitate initial note-taking or the summarizing of mechanically recorded data. When taking notes, the recorder should attempt to keep up-to-date information on the subject under review. 1. Trace the threads of an idea throughout the discussion. 2. Identify the subgroup or individual to whom an idea is important. 3. Distinguish between ideas held in common from those held by individuals. 4. Capture the vocabulary and style of the group. 5. Distinguish, if possible, among perceptions, feelings, and insights. Analysis and reporting of the focus group data. Focus group interviews cannot be used to generalize to an entire population, as the groups may not be representative of their total populations. Other advantages and disadvantages of the focus group interview. Focus group interviews give researchers the opportunity to observe a large amount of interactions on a topic in a limited period of time. Focus group interviews are susceptible to bias caused by the interview setting, the moderator, faulty questions, and an unrepresentative sample. Telephone interviews. An important type of interview is the telephone interview, which combines the advantages and disadvantages of the mail questionnaire and the personal interview. Computer-assisted telephone interviewing, or CATI, involves the automatic dialing of computer-generated telephone numbers and an interviewer equipped with a headset. Observation and usability testing. Observe means to watch attentively in a scientific or systematic manner. In observational study, the current status of a phenomenon is determined not by asking but by observing it. Observation is sometimes treated as a research method, sometimes as a data collection technique. Advantages of observational research. As a data collection technique, observation has several important advantages, including the following. 1. The use of observation makes it possible to record behavior as it occurs. 2. Observation allows one to compare what people actually did with what they said they did. Participants in a study may consciously or unconsciously report their behavior as different from the way it in fact occurred. The observed behavior may well be more valid. 3. Observational techniques can identify behavior, actions, and so on that people may not think to report because they seem unimportant or irrelevant. It can enable the researcher to examine the relative influence of many factors. 4. With observational techniques, a researcher can study subjects who are unable to give verbal reports. 5. The use of observation is generally independent of the subject's willingness to participate. For example, one could observe how library patrons are using the catalog without asking each patron beforehand if he or she were willing to be observed. There are ethical and sometimes legal implications that should be explored before deciding to observe persons without their permission, or at least their awareness. Limitations of observational research. Observational techniques do suffer from a few limitations. Some of the more important ones are as follows. 1. It is not always possible to anticipate a spontaneous event and thus be prepared to observe it. Some of the most critical activity at the library's online catalog, for example, may take place when no one is there to observe. 2. The duration of an event affects the feasibility of observing it. The activities at an online catalog are generally short enough to be easily observed. Such would not be the case in trying to observe how a faculty member conducts his or her research. 3. Some types of behavior are obviously too private or personal in nature to be observed. This is less of a disadvantage in library-related research, however, than it is in the behavioral sciences. 4. It is generally somewhat more difficult to quantify observational data than other kinds. Behavior simply cannot always be broken down into neat categories. Unstructured observation. Planning observational research involves taking into account the subject's location, purpose for being where they are, type of behavior to be observed, and the frequency and duration of the behavior. The researcher must also decide what kind of relationship he or she plans to have with the subjects. There are steps that can be taken to increase the accuracy of unstructured observations. They include the following. 1. Using 2 or more observational techniques, such as sound and visual recordings, and then comparing results. 2. Having 2 or more people observe the same behavior with the same technique and then comparing the results. 3. Being careful to distinguish between actual behavior and perceptions or interpretations of the behavior when taking notes. Researcher bias can easily creep in during this stage. 4. Avoiding becoming involved in the activity being observed. 5. Being careful not to take behavior for granted. 6. Obtaining reactions from the participants regarding the accuracy of the observations can be useful in situations where the subjects are fully aware of the role of the researcher. But one would have to be careful that doing so did not affect or bias future behavior of the subjects. Structured observation. Structured observation is a more formal technique, often used in quantitative studies to provide systematic description or to test causal hypotheses. It may be used in field studies or in laboratory-type settings, but it should focus on designated aspects of behavior. Other steps that can be taken to increase the reliability of structured observation, as well as unstructured observation in some cases, include the following. 1. Developing adequate definition of the kinds of behavior that are to be recorded, and being certain that they correspond to the specific concepts to be studied. 2. Carefully training the observers to ensure that they are adequately prepared and that they have confidence in their ability or judgment to check the appropriate categories. 3. Avoiding observer bias. Generally, the observer should take behaviors at their face value and not attempt to interpret their real meaning, at least not at the time the observations are made. Usability testing. Usability testing is a form of human ethnographic observation combined with ergonomics and cognitive psychology. The user is involved from the initial design phase through system upgrades. Some suitable, basic library-related questions for the methodology include: what is the best layout for a web page? How can reading from the screen interface be optimized? Which online fonts are the best? What makes a site difficult to use? Usability testing also can accommodate more structured, detailed questions, such as, can individual personality or cognitive skills predict internet use behavior? Can library collection holdings and library data be represented geographically in a way that users are able to understand and manipulate the data? Can users easily customize and manage discipline-specific content available in an open-source library portal? Can users quickly and easily find serials, i.e., newspapers, journals, magazines, etc., from a library's website and online catalog? Summary. In conducting survey research, the researcher has several data collection techniques at his or her disposal. Observational methods are best suited for describing and understanding behavior as it occurs.